This is the M13, a slim metal leverless controller made by Haute42. So I'm completely new to fighting games, and Tekken 8 is the first fighting game I actually wanted to learn in depth and try to climb ranks in. I have a few hours on Street Fighter 4 years ago, but I never really liked the gameplay of having to input certain moves with an analog stick on an Xbox 360 controller. But the idea of a leverless controller seemed really cool. So I borrowed my friend's Sally box, a somewhat old acrylic stack pad, and soon after I bought the M13. This cost $100. As far as I know, it's the first metal pad in this price range. If you look through AliExpress or even Amazon, you can see acrylic stack pads from Haute42 ranging from $50 to $90 depending on the size. You can buy a fight box with Sanwa buttons or their acrylic stack pads for about $100. Coming from the keyboard hobby, I was a bit blown away by how expensive these are, because $100 or a bit more in the keyboard hobby can get you a really nice keyboard already, and those are made of blocks of CNC'd aluminum. The idea of a metal pad seemed more premium, so I bought the M13 instead of the T13, which I was considering earlier. So I have the Sally box with regular MX switches, the M13 with low profile switches, and I also have an old Street Fighter Tournament Edition stick that another friend let me borrow so I can try out and compare how these all feel. So onto the M13. I got the 13 button version, which is just the standard hitbox layout with an extra up key. Since it has an extra up key, you will have to disable it for a tournament as far as I know, but that's pretty easy to do through software or just by removing the cap and switch altogether. I was using a Sally box for a while, and I like this layout because I'm very used to WASD on the keyboard. Normally people think of the thumb button as jump, but I played a lot of FPS games and always used scroll wheel down for jump, so it didn't really translate for me very well. It has this OLED screen which by default displays the layout of all the keys and shows when they're being pressed. You'll have to update the firmware to get the extra key to show on here, and I'll leave a link in the description for that. Otherwise, you can just make it a display for a black and white 128 by 64 picture. There's the 7 nubs for buttons which aren't labeled. It uses a USB-C port for plugging into PC and a USB-A port for plugging in adapters for a console, such as the Mayflash or Brook adapters. And you can use wireless adapters for this with console. And apparently it doesn't add a lot of lag or delay, which isn't exactly what most people think of when they think of wireless, but I won't go too into it because it's not something I have to deal with. But the cost of this pad plus a wireless adapter looks really good compared to a Razer Kitsune, which is also a metal pad but costs $300 because native Sony support and the Razer name. This uses the GP2040 firmware, which is an open source firmware that is made for fight pads or fight sticks. It has 1 and 2 milliseconds of latency, allows for customization of the layout, rebinding keys, configuring LEDs, and setting up your pad for console use, all with an easy to navigate web configurator. Some settings you can configure in the web configurator can also just be done on the pad itself. You can set your movement keys to emulate a left or right analog stick, where by default it's set to D-pad. You can change your SOCD mode, which means you can change which movement keys get priority when an opposite movement key gets pressed. There's up priority, last input priority, or neutral priority. And then you can also change the LED animation or the brightness. The M13 looked flawless when I took it out of the box. The anodization or the surface finish of it didn't have any banding or inconsistent areas. It's very smooth and very nice. But it is a fingerprint magnet and it will show your sweaty palms. If that's something you don't like seeing on your devices, consider the silver color, but I've heard that's also a fingerprint magnet as well. The M13 weighs 850 grams, which is noticeably heftier than the acrylic Sally box. The sides of the M13 are decently thick, and even though the top is a bit thinner in comparison, there's no point where I can press down and see it bend in any way. Just from that, I can say the build quality is pretty good. At the bottom we have this angled lip, which gives me a flat surface for the bottom of my palms to rest despite it being so thin. Whereas if this were something like an acrylic stack pad without a chamfered edge, it would feel a little uncomfortable after a long session. Of course, you should ideally float your wrists and stretch them, but this is a nice touch in terms of design for those who never made it a habit to float the wrists. And while I'm talking about the edge of the M13, I want to talk about one thing I slightly dislike about the pad, which is the size. At least for me and my big hands. Normally I want my wrist to be straight, and this is how I played on the Sally box before I got the M13, but trying to keep my wrist straight on the M13 makes this bottom left corner dig into my hand a little bit, and it gets slightly uncomfortable after a while. This is because my left hand hangs off the edge more than my right hand, just because of how the right hand keys get a bit more room than the left keys, and it's not bad, It doesn't hurt because the edges are soft, but if there was something for me to criticize, it would be that my left hand can't take full advantage of the lip because there just isn't enough space there. It feels awkward and there isn't much space for my hands positioned like that, or my wrist would be bent kind of sideways, kind of like typing on a keyboard, but kind of worse because my wrists are a bit closer together. But if I just how I play, and sometimes I'm floating my left hand and sometimes I just have part of my hand hanging out while I play. One thing I really liked about this pad were the keycaps. The T-pad uses the same keycaps, but the ones on the M13 are slightly thicker because of the paint apparently. But having these huge 26.6mm keycaps is a bit more fun than using the 21mm keycaps on the Sally box. The keycaps on the Sally box are small, flat, and 3D printed, while the keycaps on the M13 are bigger, have a slightly convex top, and rounded edges. On the Sally box, the keys are smaller and closer together, so it felt like my fingers had to be in something like a claw grip on a mouse. And I could only use my fingertips to press everything, and using my thumb for this button felt unnatural. And that was probably because the keycaps sit a bit higher above the surface. The bigger keycaps on the M13 allow the centers of each key to be more spread out, meaning there's much more room for my fingers to extend. And the low height of these keycaps allowed my thumb to press this key a lot easier, and that just became a habit of how I play now. Whereas on the Sally box, I only use my index finger for that key because of how close the keys were. Compared to the tops of the Sanwa buttons that you see on Hitbox, Fightbox, or any other arcade-style controller, they're kinda similar. Except I occasionally hit this outer ring on the Sanwa buttons, and it kinda throws me off a bit, cause if I hit the rounded edges of this keycap on the M13, I know I'm gonna get a full key press. But if I hit the rounded edge on this outer ring on the Sanwa, it doesn't depress with the button, and I kinda second guess whether I hit the button or not because the spring weight feels so light. Also, this just rattles around, which is kind of unsatisfying in comparison. But that brings me to my next point, which is the feeling of these switches. The M13 uses KLV2 low profile switches, which are the same ones in Haute42's T-pad and S-pad series. Because low profile switches aren't standardized and all these different low profile switches don't have the same pin location or center post size, these are the only 3 low profile switches you can use for the M13, aside from the low free switches. But you have to buy a pack of 90 just to use a few. And these are your standard red linears, blue clickies, and brown slightly tactile switches. The M13 uses these red low profile switches with a 3.2mm travel distance. The springs feel a little light for me personally. I wish they were a bit heavier or springier so I could feel the switch come back up faster, but it's not a big issue, you kinda just get used to it. These will be fine for most people. But for those that are looking to try different switches, and this is kind of my other small gripe with the pad, is that it uses low profile switches. Low profile switches aren't very diverse compared to MX style switches. There's a whole variety in sound and feel in MX switches. Even if you don't care for a sound for your pad, there's a lot of variety in just the feeling of a switch, such as long pull versus short pull or rail bottom out, spring weight, travel distance, clicky switches, silent switches, or tactile switches, but the option and variety is there. Not so much the case with these low profile switches. The Sally box uses MX style switches, and I could go in depth about low profile versus MX switches, but I'll just try to summarize it. Most MX style switches have a longer travel distance than low profile switches by anywhere between 0.3mm to 0.8mm. Some people see the longer travel distance as a disadvantage. I see it more as preference and negligible in terms of what's better for gaming. There's a difference of 0.7mm in actuation distance, in where MX style switches have to be pressed down further before it registers a key press, but I think that's kind of negligible in game. Sanwa buttons in comparison feel ridiculously sensitive, and they have relatively lightweight springs. I was getting accidental inputs once in a while playing Tekken with this, because one of my fingers would brush against the top of a button and I didn't mean to press it. On this shop it says the actuation distance is 0.85mm and the total travel is 2.53mm. Sounds about right after using it, honestly. I didn't like it because it was so sensitive, but I figure that's just something you get used to, or it's a skill issue. But I would probably like it a lot more if the spring in these were heavier because I can't really feel the button coming back up after pressing it. For me personally, I'd rather stick to the low profiles in the M13 than use the Sanwa buttons, but it's all preference. The smaller body of the low profile switches do allow the pad to be very thin, whereas using MX style switches would require the pad to be thicker. And using a switch design that kind of has a fixed travel distance allows for the keycaps to be designed in a way that will have it sit kind of flush with the surface of the pad, which I think adds to the feeling of using it. Even though I really like the low profile design of the M13, I really hope to see a metal pad in the future with a wider body and using MX switches. I like how low these keycaps sit because you can slide fairly easily. Sliding across 3 of these keys doesn't feel that great, but it's definitely doable, and very easy across 2 keys. On the Sanwa buttons, it feels a little easier with a lighter touch, simply because the Sanwa buttons don't need to be pressed down very much. Just gliding on top of the buttons would be good enough. So I didn't really like how the keys sounded. They sounded kinda plasticky and hollow sounding. So I lubed the switches and the springs inside them, and this made it sound deeper and eliminated spring ping. I had planned on sticking some foam in there, but then I realized I had these laying around. These are wheel weights with a really strong adhesive backing. These are about 4mm thick and fit just inside the hollow space of the top piece. These are sitting about a millimeter or 2 above the PCB, so if you do want to do something like this, make sure you have a really strong adhesive, or just use foam actually. If the adhesive on these failed, then the weights will move around in there and potentially damage something if I'm not careful. But the M13 is good value for the money and could set a new standard for leverless controllers with its metal casing. The build quality is great and sturdy, and the lip at the front of the pad is great for anyone playing on their desk. The keycaps are really satisfying to use with my fingers extended with how low they sit to the top of the pad and their rounded shape. If you have big hands like me, you might want to consider the bigger T13 or T16 from Haute42, but for me, I've adjusted how I play with it and I don't mind the size as much anymore. It has a GP2040 in it, which receives updates from time to time and allows console play to be much cheaper with support for adapters, and it makes it easier to configure layout settings for the M13 or any other pad that uses a GP2040. The increase in price from Haute42's acrylic pads feels appropriate, but the downside is you can't stick any really cool art in there unless you're okay with stickers. One thing I liked about Haute42 is they have an open Discord community, and a lot of people in there are pretty friendly and willing to help out in case you have any questions or problems. Someone from Haute42 is also in there regularly answering questions and helping with support. And there's a lot of different resources in there for certain specs like keycap size and firmware files, and people are sharing their artwork as well. It's a nice community, so definitely check it out if you have any questions. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you took the time to watch this all the way through, I appreciate you. I'm a keyboard hobbyist, I love my collection of switches, and I'm just getting into these kinds of controllers because I look at them similarly to keyboards, in which they are a cool input device. Haute42 didn't ask me to review this was kind of just a for fun thing I worked on in my spare time, but maybe if I get another interesting leverless controller or something like that, I'll review it. But let me know what you guys think. Thanks.